Hi there, my name is Professor Stewart and welcome to English 1220 Introduction to Poetry. Today we are going to be taking a journey through British Romantic literature, starting with a quotation by William Wordsworth. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs, which on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect landscapes with the quiet of the sky. William Wordsworth, lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey, 1798. So you'll notice some major themes going on here in this poem that you'll see throughout romantic poetry particularly. Notice the title is very specific about place and time. You'll see that a lot. Exactly in the same way that an impressionistic painting is a moment in time that may not look exactly like you see the scene, but it's the impression received by the artist. Well, here is the impression received by the poet at this particular place during this particular time. Some of the themes that we're going to see in British Romanticism include rebellion, astonishment, which is a feeling of amazement in the face of nature and the enormity of nature, pantheism, the archaic, friendship, fear, Frankenstein, suffering, the cult of personality, death, imagination, sublime. So these are all themes that you may explore in romantic poetry, and we'll get into a little bit more later. Reference to Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the death of the Albatross leads to an uprising of zombie sailors. Sounds about right. Check it out. It's a great poem. So let's talk about the beginnings of British Romanticism. How do we know it began? Any artistic movement or historical movement has to have a date of beginning and ending. And here we'll see that 1789 was the date of the French Revolution. That was the same year that William Blake, the visionary romantic poet, published his Songs of Innocence. 1789, the French Revolution was caused by another revolution that happened elsewhere. Can anybody think before 1789, was there another revolution anywhere? That's right. The American Revolution actually helped the French to see that their system of government was not working for the people. It was only working for the individual who harnessed all the power, all the resources for himself and his family. 1792 was right at the beginning of British Romanticism, and Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is considered the first work of feminism. Mary Wollstonecraft was a pretty amazing figure. If you ever get a chance to read, if you pursue women's studies or literature, it's a wonderful and very revolutionary piece of writing. She was a feminist. So again, we're talking 18th century France, it wasn't very common. And she married the philosopher and anarchist William Godwin. So here we have a feminist and an anarchist teaming up. So that's a pretty wild couple. And of course, an anarchist is someone who doesn't believe in organized government. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft died giving birth to her second daughter, Mary, who would go on to marry the Romantic poet Percy Shelley, and the name Mary Shelley may ring a bell. Mary Shelley, mother, wrote the first feminist treatise, and Mary Shelley wrote the first horror story. The Romantic poets, again, we're talking pre-electricity, pre-indoor plumbing. And so these guys would all hang out and gals would all hang out at Byron's castle and trade ghost stories to see who could tell the scariest story. And guess what? The 18-year-old Mary Shelley, maybe 16-year-old, told the scariest story, and they encouraged her to publish it, to write it as a novel and publish it. Some people believe the monster represents logic. Some people believe the monster represents Percy Shelley, the husband. There's a lot of different ways to look at this. Now, we'll be looking at the two generations of British Romantic poets. Again, we're not digging deep. If you ever pursue literature, become an English major, you will take courses just on the Romantic poets, for example. Or I once took a survey course just on William Blake. You can really, really dig in that way. Now, the first generation, again, there's many, many more poets, women poets, for example, who aren't represented here, but these are the three. Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge are the three core poets that we'll have time to look at. Notice their fairly long lives. They overlap the second generation because the second generation sort of lived fast and died young. In the second generation, John Keats, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron. One of the great works of Romantic poetry was the lyrical ballads. Note that there's no author listed. This was published by William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge as a poetry for the people. And they wanted to, in 1798, again, pretty soon after the French Revolution, they're in England, but there's a lot of crossover between England and France. And they wanted to publish a piece of writing that would be affordable, small, affordable, and in the language of the people that would convey the importance of nature and the importance of imagination to the common people. Now, Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads, again, he didn't list his name there. It was just sort of a manifesto of Romantic poetry, announced a break from neoclassical poetry and the English Enlightenment. And again, the Enlightenment came in the 18th century, and it was the break from the church. So the church had control over all art, all writing, up until that point through the Middle Ages. So the 17th, 18th century, the Enlightenment broke away from the church. And then we have, of course, the Romantic poets who break away from the Enlightenment and logic. Every artistic movement, every political movement is always just a reaction to one that came before. Romantic poetry speaks of the power of nature to show the way of the spirit. So nature is often listed with a capital N, sort of a quasi-religious worship of nature. In the preface, again, we're still talking about the preface in lyrical ballads, Wordsworth praises imagination. Again, often you'll see imagination with a capital I, because it's a tool that gives voice to individual experience. Again, anyone who's ever been to the Grand Canyon and looked into it, or climbed a mountain and looked down, or just been in awe of nature at any time, maybe the animal world, maybe the plant world, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about that feeling of standing helpless in the face of nature. And finally, the preface tries to encourage people to think about the fact that poetry makes us better people. It helps us to stand in the shoes of someone else, to see the world from someone else's perspective. the idea that the poems were called lyrical ballads is sort of goes against itself, because um, a lyrical poem doesn't necessarily tell a story. A ballad always tells a story. So it's a little, you'll find poets are constantly sort of bringing up this contrast and sort of pushing the envelope. The ballad stanza, which we'll hear more about, anyone familiar with the theme from Gilligan's Island, is written in ballad stanzas. So for example, the Coleridge's poem of zombie pirates, the rhyme of the ancient mariner, can be read to the theme of Gilligan's Island. Any ballad, you can test whether it's a ballad or not by singing to this theme. Okay. Lord Byron. Who is Lord Byron? Well, he was the grandson of a Scottish laird. He drank wine from a human skull. He was a radical pacifist. And again, that phrase alone just tells us everything we need to know about the opposition within each of these poets. Is he believed so strongly against war that it was a radical stance. So that's Lord Byron. We'll be reading one or two of his poems. Here's a list of achievements and sort of life experiences of Lord Byron. He did live in a castle. He was the beginning, before, as I said, before the Romantic poets, people, an audience didn't really get too obsessed with who wrote the poem. They just loved the poem. And so at this point, we finally have the idea of pop culture hero, a cult of personality, where people wanted to know Byron. Is he really the hero in Childe Harold? Is that really Byron? What's he like? And you could read from this list here. It's really hard to pin him down. He's all over the place, but he did join the fight for Greek independence in the early 1800s, and really believed he definitely walked the talk. Now, John Keats was one of the few Romantic poets who didn't come from the upper classes. He never attended university. He helped, and he helped people. He helped his brother when his brother was sick with tuberculosis, and you can see he died at a very young age. And he's this sort of classic example of the artist who's sort of like a comet who blazes across the sky and dies young. Percy Shelley, again, you'll recognize that last name. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and he became obsessed with the young Mary Shelley in large part because of who her parents were. He knew well of both of Mary's parents. And so we know when the British Romanticism began, and I'll give you a minute to remember that. Why do we pin British Romanticism on the late 1700s? 1789 particularly. That's right, because of the French Revolution. But how do we know it was over? Well, Queen Victoria took her place on the throne in 1837, and Alfred Lord Tennyson published his first major collection in 1830. So around 1830, 1837 is when we mark the end of Romanticism and the beginning of the Victorian era. And that is the end. So We'll have one more resource on Romantic literature. We'll be spending the first 3 weeks or so looking at the work of the British Romantic poets. And thank you for listening and have a great day.